Oke, yang pertama saya ulang lagi tentang ini apa data type. Walaupun Anda sudah sudah biasa, cuman coba saya perlihatkan kepada Anda lebih ini lagi.
This is important because it helps your code run faster. You see, the advantage of VBA is that it can keep a lot of things in memory, and it works through that memory to give you the outcome that you want. And we work with VBA's memory when we use variables. By default, VBA assigns the data type called variant, and variant means that it changes depending on the data type. So if that data type is text, number, date, and so on. It's going to allocate around 16 bytes of memory if it's a number, and a little bit more if it's text, so if it's string. Now, if you know that the variable you're going to be using is a small number, because let's say you're just capturing page numbers, for example, then you can declare that variable as byte. Guess how much memory space a byte takes? 1 byte, right? So that's 1 versus 16. And that's a big difference, which becomes obvious on the bigger macros, the more complex, longer macros. The other important thing to know is that each data...
Jadi, kenapa kita perlu sekali mengetahui menggunakan data type tertentu, itu agar kita tahu bahwa kalau kita nyimpan misalnya ya dan tidak, kita gunakan byte, itu cuma menyimpan 1 byte dalam memori komputer ataupun nanti di memori hard disk. Nah, kalau Anda menggunakan string itu 16. Satu variabel setiap datanya menyimpan 16 byte. Kalau dia 1000 berarti 16.000 byte. Sedangkan kalau pakai bit misalnya iya tidak, Anda bisa menggunakan hanya 16 bit. Perbedaannya cukup besar dan otomatis karena dia menggunakan memori besar, jadi mengurangi kemampuan prosesnya komputer maupun ini. Nah, data-data apa saja yang diperlukan, yang harus Anda ketahui berikut ini.
Data type has a range. So let me show you what I mean with that. But first, let's take a look at the common data types. I've ordered them by popularity based on my own code. You can see that the smaller the memory space used, the smaller the range here. So for example, a byte has a range from 0 to 255. So now let's imagine that that report you were making has actually 300 pages. And you want to keep that number inside the variable that you've already declared as byte. You're going to run into a problem, and that problem is going to be a VBA error because it can't handle that data type. It can't put in that 300, or it can't put in any number above 255 in this variable. So instead of using byte in this case, you could use integer, which also takes up a lot less space, just 2 bytes compared to the 16 bytes for variant. If you are looping through a lot of rows, you're on the safe side to use long, right? Because that has a really big data range, which can handle the number of rows in Excel, right? So be careful, don't declare them as integer if you think that you could have data that goes past this number of rows. Boolean uses 2 bytes of memory. Double is good for declaring percentages, or if you're doing calculations that require high precision. String is for text. Objects is for things like declaring ranges. So if you want to declare a cell as a range, or a sheet as a worksheet, or if you're declaring workbooks in variables, you'll need an object data type. Now, variant can come in handy as well, because you could run into a case that you have a variable that could be Boolean, but it could also keep nothing inside, right? So if it's really changing between different data types, it makes sense to declare it as variant. Declaring variables basically means that you give VBA a heads up that it needs to free up some memory space for your variables, which will, in most cases, be less than the default. We use the dim keyword before the variable. The names that you give to variables is really up to you, but special naming rules apply. So for example, we can't have spaces, so use underscore instead. You can't start with a number. You can't use a dot or exclamation mark or other obvious symbols like the @ sign or the dot.
Nah, kalau di sini kan membiasakan bahwa tadi kalau Anda lihat bahwa gunakan apa namanya gunakan tanda sambung. Kalau saya tidak, saya lebih cenderung menggunakan kalau misalnya variabelnya namanya no spaces, maka no S-nya saya pakai huruf besar spaces. Atau misalnya nama saya gunakan Aurino, Jamarisnya pakai D besar gitu. Jadi no number ya, no number saya sambung no N-nya besar number. Itu saya biasakan seperti itu. Jadi tidak perlu menggunakan tanda garis bawah. Boleh Anda menggunakan tanda garis bawah. Jangan pakai strip. Kalau strip dianggapnya minus. Ya.
You can't use a dot or exclamation mark or other obvious symbols like the @ sign or the dollar or and so on. Also, try to come up with a nickname that's kind of short and as obvious as you can get. So in this case, I'm declaring the myText variable as a string data type, so basically as text. What some programmers like to
Lihat ya, biasakan misalnya seperti myText atau textku misalnya terserah. Tapi kalau dua kata sebaiknya jambungannya itu pakai huruf besar seperti itu.
do is to follow a naming convention. The common naming convention is to use the initials of the data type in your variable. So, for example, if something is an integer number, they would put int before the variable or just I before the variable. And in this case, if this is my text is string, I would put str my text. I personally don't follow any special rules, except some rules that I've created for myself along the way, such as for sheets, I would use sh before the name. For user forms, I also put an initial before that indicates to me what type of control I'm referring to in that user form. Other than that, I've left my options open for picking a name. So it's really up to you, pick the method that you can relate with most. But let's say I'm defining last row as long, okay, because it could be a big number. I have a lot of rows in Excel, so I'm going to define it as long. If I didn't put anything here, it's automatically defined as variant, okay, which takes up more space than defining it as long.
Saya ulang lagi ya. Saya ini ya. Kalau Anda tidak menyebutkan S apa variabelnya, maka otomatis dia dianggap sebagai varian 16 bit. Ya, paling besar dia. Oke.
Now I want to assign the number of rows to this variable. Officially, you do this with the let statement. You would say let last row equal, now I'm just going to do rows.count. So that's the number of rows in my Excel worksheet, right? So this let statement is something that you might not have seen in other projects. That's because it's optional and people don't use it. But in reality, what you're doing is you're letting this last row equals that, but you don't need it, so you're not going to see it in my code either. I leave it out. Okay, but just so that you know what it is, in case you see it in other code that you have to work with. Variables don't just hold data and string types, they can also hold objects. Common objects are, for example, the workbook object, worksheet, or the range object. The way you declare them is like this. To assign variables to objects, you need something, and you need the set statement. Right? So new sheet equals active sheet would give you a problem. You have to say set new sheet equals active sheet. Okay, and this is something that I forgot a lot at the beginning. I still forget sometimes when I'm writing the code, but the way I remember it is the moment you notice that you've declared something that's not a string, that's not long, that's not integer, it looks like it's an object because it's a workbook, worksheet, or range, you need set. If not, you get an error. I'm going to show you the type of error you get. So whenever you see that, just remember you've probably forgotten the set keyword. This tutorial is a part of my Excel VBA course. If you're interested to find out more, check out the descriptions below.
Oke.
In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can create a VBA routine that's going to create a customized workbook. The customization that we're going to make is this. We want to create a new workbook that contains a worksheet for each company. So we have the list of companies here. Each of the worksheets in this new workbook should get a name from here. Then inside each of these worksheets, we want to populate cell A1 to equal the company name, and cell A2 should be the manager's name. Here, we can make good use of arrays. We can keep this information in a two-dimensional array because we're dealing with rows and columns, so rows will be one dimension and columns will be the second dimension. So once we store this in the array, it's really easy to reuse that information. Okay, so let's see how we can set that up. Let's bring up the Visual Basic Editor, Alt F11. I've already created an empty module called Project Activity. Inside this module, let's create a new sub called Manager Report. Okay, let me collapse this. First off, let's dim our array. I'm gonna dim comp info, okay, we call it comp info. It's gonna have two dimensions, right? So one is gonna be for rows and the other one for columns. So in this case, let's assume that our companies are fixed. I'm going to use the two-dimensional fixed array and say 1 to 8, and the columns are 1 to 2. My lower bound is 1. That's an easier way of working with rows and columns, right? So if we
Jadi maksudnya tentunya yang baris sama kolom. Jadi jumlah barisnya adalah ini 1 sampai 8, ini satunya ada 2 kolom, ini 8 gitu ya. Kalau datanya disimpannya bentuknya seperti itu.
leave out the 1 and just put in the upper bound, the lower bound is automatically going to be 0. Okay, so that's one thing we need. Second, we're going to be looping through the rows here and the columns here. So let's dim them as well. So I'm going to dim R for the rows as well. Since we don't have that many companies, and we're not going to have over like 200 companies, I'm going to dim this as byte. And I'm also going to dim the column as byte since it's only 2 columns here. Now we can start filling up our array. Let's create our loop. We say first is the rows. So for R equal 1 to 8, and let's do next R. Okay, so we're going to go through each row, but the moment we're in the first row, we also need to loop through the columns. So we need to do column 1, column 2. Then it's for C equals 1 to 2, and let's do next C here. Now we want to fill up our array, so this one, with the values of this table, right? Because right now, our array, our box, is empty, right? We need to fill that up. So we're going to say comp info. Now we need to decide on the row and column. Since we're looping through them, I'm going to do R and C. Now this equals cells. Now, is this also R and C dot value?
Nah, perhatikan ya. Jadi salah satu penggunaannya kan kalau dengan seperti ini berarti dia akan memasukkan pertama 1,1, 1,2, kemudian 2,1, 2,2. Artinya 1,1, 1,2, 2,1, 2,2 dan seterusnya. Nah, ini akan dilakukan makanya mulai dari 1 sampai 8 dan C-nya 1 sampai 2. Setelah 2 dia akan keluar masuk lagi dan ini berulang-ulang. Karena itu for R sama dengan 1 sampai dengan 8, C dari 1 sampai dengan 2. Pemahamannya seperti itu. Dia akan menyimpan kemana? Ke info ini. Company info ini. Nanti dia menjadi satu deret yang isinya adalah 2 kolom.
Well, it would have been rnc.value if my data range here started from A1, right? Then I could leave it like this. But I can't leave R like this because R actually starts from 7, so I need to make an adjustment. But C, I can leave like this, right? Because I'm in column 1 and 2, just like my array 1 and 2. For R, I need to move them by 6. I could do +6. And to make this easier to read, I could declare a constant for this on top. So let's do constant start row as, now this would also be byte in this case, but if our entire data set is like somewhere on the bottom of our sheet, I just want to be sure we don't run into problems. So let me do as long here, and it equals 6. Since it's a constant, we're going to define it on top. This one I can remove and replace with start row. Okay.
Nah, kalau yang tadi kan dim kominfo, ya ini adalah mendefinisikan variabel kominfo yang berupa array, dim r sebagai byte itu berarti sebagai variabel yang isinya byte dan seterusnya. Sedangkan di sini kita seringkali contohnya konstan P sama dengan berapa, dan konstan kita itu menunjukkan dia tidak akan berubah-ubah. Jadi konstan start row sebagai 6 ditambah 1 sama dengan 7. Jadi dia mulai dari 7 gitu ya.
So that's it, right? This way I'm going to fill up the array. Let's just bring up the locals window. That's a good one to look at your array after it gets filled. Let's run this, but let me stop it before it leaves the loop and empties the array. So let me press play here and see if everything gets populated properly. So this is each of my dimensions in my array. Let's open that. So CompInfo 1, 1, that's jellyfish, 1, 2, so row 1, 2 in the table, that's this one. And let's look at the last one as well. H1 is Pez, and H2 is that. Okay, so my array here has been filled now with the contents of this table. Okay, so let's stop this.
Jadi kalau Anda lihat di sini, ini dia membuka local view ini, dia selama dijalankan hasilnya sebetulnya apa di sini dia akan jadi view local window, itu bisa dilakukan dari menunya.
And H2 is that. Okay, so my array here has been filled now with the contents of this table. Okay, so let's stop this and get rid of the breakpoints there. So we fill up the array. Now we want to create a new workbook, and then inside that workbook create new sheets for each of these companies. We can also declare variables for them. I'm going to say dim new book as a workbook, and dim, let's call it sheet new, sh new, as worksheet. Let's move down, and after this loop, we're going to create a new workbook. So let's set our new book equals workbooks.add. Now we want to loop through this workbook and add new sheets to it. So I'm actually going to reuse R for worksheets here as well, right? Because that R is my rows here is 8, so I'm going to have 8 worksheets as well. I can create a new loop here and say for R equals 1 to 8. Let's do next R. Now here I'm going to create a new sheet. Every time the loop runs, a new sheet is created. So I'm going to set sh new equals my new book dot worksheets dot add. Okay, so I'm creating a new sheet for each of these here. Then we need to assign the name of the sheet to be equal to the company name. We're going to do sh new dot name equals, here we can refer to our filled box, our filled array. So that's going to be comp info Now, what do I have to select here? What's the row? It's the R, right? So if it's in number 1, it's going to be jellyfish. If it's number 2, it's going to be dance ring. What about the column? That's going to be fixed, right? Because my company name is in column 1. Then I can also do sh new dot. Now I want to write in cell A1, so I'm going to do dot range A1 dot value equals the comp info, the same thing, right? It's going to be R1. And now the next one, well, here I could have actually used a with and end with statement. I can do range A2 dot value equals, what should this one be now? R2, right? Because I want to put the manager name in cell A2. That's it. We close the loop there, and if everything goes well, we should get a new workbook with this information filled. Let's test that. Let's add also a button for this. Manager report, and let's call this create reports. Okay, let's test. We got a new workbook. It's called Book 1. We have, let me just bring this up so that you can see the different tabs. So we have one tab per company. We have the company name and we have the manager name in front of it right here. Okay, so that's how you can use arrays in your code. You can fill up these arrays and reuse them to create such reports. This video was brought to you by Unlock Excel VBA and Macros course, where you're going to learn how to simplify your work and how to save time.
Oke, saya
Do a VBA function that lets you check whether a file or folder exists. The function that lets us check for the existence of a file or folder is the dir or dir function. Now this function takes a path argument. That's basically an address. And it returns the name of your file or folder. If that name isn't found, then dir returns an empty string. Now the attributes argument is optional, and they're basically the ones that are listed here. Default is VB normal, which are files with no specific attributes. Now you could filter for specific attributes like read-only files or filter specifically for folders by using the constants that are listed here. One thing that comes in handy here, and we're going to see that in a second, is that we can use wildcards for the path argument. For example, you can use the asterisk sign for the multiplication operator as a wildcard that changes sign. Basically, it represents a placeholder for any text that can come in between. Another wildcard you can use is the question mark. This one represents a fixed length string. If you use it once, it means just one character can be variable. So just one character can be anything. So that was the theory. Let's take a look at an example. This video is brought to you by Unlock Excel VBA and Macros course. So if you'd like to learn VBA in a structured way from the ground up, I suggest you check out the complete course. You're going to find the link in the description below the video or in the YouTube cards provided. So we're going to do 2 tasks here. Task number 1 is to see how we can use the dir function to check if a file exists. If it doesn't exist, we're going to give the user a message telling them that this file does not exist. And if it does exist, we could, for example, open that file. In task number 2, we're going to check if a folder exists. Now, if it doesn't exist, we will prompt the user with a message box asking them whether they want to create that folder. And if they say yes, we're going to create the folder for them. So let's switch to VB, Alt F11. I've already created an empty module here, and we're going to start with our first sub called File Exists. So remember, the dir function returns a name, and that name is a string, so we can declare a variable for that. I'm going to actually use file name. Okay, that can be any name you give it. I normally go with file name for these as string. Then we're going to do file name equals. So since this is a normal data type, it's not an object, we don't need the set keyword. Now we're going to go with dir. Now dir is also in the VBA global library, so you can get to it like this. Its specific compartment is called the file system class. So you can also get to it like this. I'm going to give it this path name. Okay, then I'm going to close bracket.
Maksudnya Anda bisa langsung pakai dir atau secara lengkap VBA titik file system titik dir. Ya.
Okay, so I'm just going to go with the default VB normal. Now, if this doesn't exist, we're going to get an empty string, right? So we can check for that and say if file name equals VB null string. Now we can also get to this through IntelliSense by going to vba.constants.vb null string. Let's do an endif here. Then we want to inform the user that the file does not exist. Okay, so the moment this string is empty, it means file does not exist. Else, now as a first step, let's just get the file name. Once we see that this works, we're going to actually open that file. Okay, so let's run this, and we get the file name back. Okay, so that's the file that I have in this directory. Now let's just use wildcards here as well. So if I do s2 underscore, and I'm going to put star sign here, and for the last one, let's actually use the question mark here. Instead of the message box that's open that file, we're going to do workbooks.open. Now we need the full path name. Actually going to be this, and the full file name, which is now our file name variable. Okay, so let's just check that folder, what we have on there. Okay, so that's the VBA folder. I have this S2 sitting here. Now let's run this and see if it opens our file, and our file is opened. Now let's move on to the second task, where we're going to check if a folder exists. And if it doesn't exist, we're actually going to create that folder. Here we can declare two variables. We can declare the variable called path. That's going to include the entire path together with the folder name. And we can declare the variable called folder, which is just going to be our folder name. Okay, now we can define these. So path equals, let's just work with this folder. And I'm going to add in a folder that doesn't exist in the VBA folder. So backslash, let's call it S12. Now folder is going to equal dir, our path, okay, which is this one here. And since this is a folder, it's VB directory. Now we need to check if this is empty or not, right? Because if it's empty, it means it doesn't exist. So if folder equals VB null string, then let's do an endif here. Now right here, we want to give the user the opportunity to create the folder. So we're going to ask them with a message box whether they want to create that folder or not, and allow them to click on yes or no. So it's best here if I create a variable to keep the user's answer in. So I'm going to dim answer as VB message box result, and inside here we're going to do answer equals message box. And we're going to ask them if they want to create it. Then we're going to give them the options to click on yes or no. And let's just give this a title, create path question mark. Now let's check their answers. This time I'm going to use the select case statement. So select case answer, and let's do and select here. So case is VB yes, then we want to make or create this directory, and the function for that is mkdir. This one again is in the global library, so you can get to it like this, or to the file system class. Okay, and it needs one argument, and that one argument is the path, which includes the folder name. And it's a good coincidence because we've also called our variable path, so we can go with that. Now, for no, or let's just do case else, we just want to exit the sub, right? So in case the folder doesn't exist, they're going to get this prompt. But if the folder does exist right now, we're not informing them in any way. The macro is just going to exit. So we could give them some information, and just before we do our endif, we can add an else, add a message box saying folder exists. Okay, so S12 does not exist on here yet, so we should be getting that message box. Okay, let's test. Path does not exist. Would you like to create it? Yes. Okay, now let's just double check. S12 is there. So let's run this again, see if we see that folder exists. So this is how you can use the dir function to check whether a file or a folder exists. And depending on the outcome, you can decide what you want to do in your code.
Oke. Nah, yang selanjutnya adalah saya akan teruskan dengan if yang berikutnya.
Today I'm going to show you how you can use the if statement in VBA. Now this is one of the most common statements, one of the most useful statements in VBA, because it comes in really handy whenever you want to build in some type of logical thinking inside your macros. The if VBA statement is actually very similar to Excel's if formula. The way it works is that you tell VBA what you want to happen if a certain condition occurs. And you can have many conditions. You could have some conditions that have to be true, that have to apply together, or some conditions where you want something to happen if either of those conditions apply. So this is where you can work with the AND as well as the OR functions in VBA. So let's start off simple. What I'm going to show you first is how the if function works on its own, and we're going to base it on one single cell. Once we get that to work, we're going to apply an if condition to a range of cells. So basically, we're going to loop through them. First, let's bring up the VBA editor, Alt F11. I'm going to insert a new module. Just click anywhere, right mouse click, insert module. Okay, by default it's module 1. You can change the name down here. The sub, let me just call this simple if. In the first simple if statement that we're going to do, I want to copy this number in B9 to C9 if it's greater than 0. Okay, so all I have to do is type in if my number is in range B9 dot value, if that's greater than 0, then I want to copy it to C9, so I'm going to use the assignment statement here, and I'm going to say range C9 dot value equals range B9 dot value. Okay, so you see I use if here and then. Now if you have everything in one line because you just have one thing you want to occur after you type in if, then you can leave it like this. You don't need to close the statement with an end if. But the moment you have more things happening, so let's say we wanted to change the color of this, we wanted to add a border to this, then we need to break it up like this and then type in an end if on the bottom here. Now let's try this. I'm going to press play. We're going to see 45 in here. Now if I put this to a -2, let's just remove this. Let's bring up the editor. Actually, I'm going to snap this in, so I'm just going to drag it all the way to the side to fix it. This way it doesn't disappear all the time. Press play here. Nothing happened. Right? If I put 500 here and I press play, I get 500 here. How do we bring and in here? We do it on the first line. So right here, I'm going to add an and. What's the second condition that I want to happen before I copy this value? Well, let's say I want the value to be between 1 and 400. So I'm going to make sure that range B9 dot value is less than or equal to 400 before I do that. Okay, so when I press play, this number shouldn't appear here. It doesn't. Now, if I have 399 and I press play, it appears. And for 400, it should appear too. Okay, the OR function works in the same way like the AND, except it checks if either of these conditions apply, and then it copies your data. Let's now expand on this and loop through this range and look for these different conditions. So let's do sub if loop. That takes us to task number 2. Here we want to highlight cells between 1 to 400 in green. This means we need to loop through this, which means that we need to find beginning of the range and end of the range. And there are many different ways you can do this. You could fix the range. You could dynamically find the end of the range by using Excel down, or going the other way by going to the bottom of your workbook and doing Excel up. We're looking for the current region. There are many ways, and I cover them inside my VBA course. Now, I'm just going to show you one practical way here, and that's to use table referencing. I'm going to convert this data set to a table. Just click anywhere inside and press Control-T. The table has headers. I'm going to say OK. And the first thing I do is I go and clear the style. So it takes me back to my own style. And under Design, which is a tab that pops up there, because this is a table, I'm just going to change the name to Table Sales and press Enter. Now, I'm going to use this range here. So if I just go to any cell and type in equals, and I highlight this just to get the syntax that I need, I'm going to copy and paste this in there. Now, in the cell, it tells me value because obviously I have a lot of numbers here. It can't show them in one cell. But the moment you put this inside a formula that can handle the different values, you're going to see the numbers. But I don't care about this actually. All I want is this syntax, which I copied. I'm going to remove this and go here. Now, I want the macro to look through each cell in this range. I have a video on the for each statement. I'm going to link to that below this video in the description. First, I'm going to dim my variables. I'm going to call this cell as a range. Now I'm going to use my for each statement. For each cell in my range that I copied, so that's going to be range, quotation marks, paste what I copied, close this with next cell. Now our task says highlight cells between this. Here we need our if statement, right? Because we need to check the value of each cell. The value that we're checking is actually what we did right here. So I'm going to copy and paste this right here. Instead of fixing the range to this one specific cell, I'm going to do cell.value, and for this one as well, cell.value, right? So when you see it in red or you get some pop-up message saying that it's invalid, that means that there's something missing. What is missing? Then. So if you have an if, you need a then. So I'm going to close the end if. End if is like closing your brackets when you type in the formula. Now what do we want to happen? We want the cell color to be green. Right, so that's cell dot. Now the color property belongs to the interior object. Right, and that's something that I also cover in my course in detail about how to find these relationships. You can see that clearly in the object library of VBA as well. So cell.interior.color equals, we can dig into the library and get VBA's constant for green.
Untuk memberi warna kotaknya itu interior color. Tapi kalau untuk memberikan nama fontnya, hurufnya menjadi warna tertentu, maka di sini menjadi cell.font, ganti .color.
And we can get to the library by typing in VBA dot. It's in section color constants dot. Now we see the colors. There is our VB green. Right, but these colors aren't really that fancy. So let's just take a look at how green works. I'm just going to press play. And you can see this. It's a bit too bright. Now what I normally do is I pick my own color. So let's say for green, I want this one, right? This is a much nicer green. To find the color code for this, what you can do is use the immediate window. So I'm going to go to View, bring up the immediate window, and I'm going to query the color of that. So notice that my cell is activated. Now I'm going to go to the immediate window, put a question mark, type in active cell dot interior dot color. Press enter. That's the code I need to get this green. So actually, I'm going to change that to this nicer green, right? So let's just run that, and we get the nicer one. Okay, so that's a simple if-then statement. Now let's do something more. Let's make another exception. We want 1 to 400 to be green, but everything else should be yellow, right? So let's bring up a nice yellow in here that we want. So I'm going to go with this one. Now, all I'm going to do is press enter to get the code, which is this. How do I bring that in my if statement? I use the else. You're probably familiar with Excel's if formula, right? Whenever you start writing if something, then this, otherwise this, else is the otherwise. All you have to do is type in else and tell it what you want to happen if your first condition doesn't happen. And I want this color to happen. So I'm going to press play, and everything else is yellow. Let's make this a little bit more complicated by adding in another condition. I want any negative values, I have one here, to be red. Everything else yellow. What we had before should be green. So 1 to 400 green, negative red, everything else yellow. Let's come up with a nice red color. Let's go with this one. Now, this cell is active, right? So I still have my statement there. I'm going to press enter. That's the color code I can use. Where do I bring it in? I have if and else. So before the else, I can add an else if statement. And right after that, I need to put the statement for what it should check for. So I want to say if cell.value is less than 0, right? So if it's negative, then I want the color to be this 192. And notice the else if statement also needs the then. So don't forget the then. We're going to add in cell.interior.color equals 192 here. Okay, so now we have an if, else if, basically if the number isn't between this, but it's minus, do this. Otherwise, for everything else, do this. So this means that this one should become red when I press play. And it does. Okay, so that's how you can use the if statement. That's how you can move through a bunch of cells. And that's how you can use the color code that you want to use in your files in your VBA statements. If you like this video and you want to learn more about VBA, make sure you check out.
Oke, silakan ada pertanyaan atau mau coba dulu?